So, you might have noticed that there wasn't a video last week. That's because I've been busy. The very excellent Final Fantasy XIV has piqued my interest in MMOs, these small virtual societies, one of the first forms of broad online communication connecting thousands of people to each other. But Taigen, you say, assuming you watched this video, wasn't the Play-Doh the first online community? Well, actually, we're both right. See, the earliest precursor of what we know now as the MMO were multi-user dungeons, or MUDs. Of course, dungeon comes from Dungeons and Dragons, and remember what 70% of Play-Doh games were trying to emulate? Well, technically, we need to wind back to 1975, when Will Crowther created the seminal Colossal Cave adventure, the first piece of what would become known as interactive fiction, or the text adventure. A year later, Don Woods would reimagine CCA as just adventure, a much more developed version of the original. In '77, a group of MIT students expanded the concept even further with Zork for the PDP-10 microcomputer. It would become known by the file name it was ported as, Dungeon. This brings us to 1978, when Roy Trubshaw of the University of Essex created a tribute to Zork, able to be played by multiple users over a shared network. He'd call it Multi-User Dungeon. Over time, these MUDs would gain popularity amongst computer users. Keep in mind that, much like Play-Doh, users could only connect over the rather limited networks of their universities. But with the growth of services like ARPANET, they would become accessible to people across countries. These are all very primitive as games, of course. Many were still text-based and revolved around the dungeon crawling style, which was already well-worn. This brings us to 1986 and Habitat. Habitat was envisioned as an experiment into the still uncharted territory of a virtual world. Developed by Lucasfilm Games, not LucasArts, Lucasfilm Games, it was built by a team of 5 people: Chip Morningstar, Randy Farmer, Eric Wilmunder, Janet Hunter, and Gary Winnick. Launching on the Commodore 64, it ran through Quantum Link, a pre-internet dial-up service. Users were dropped into a two-dimensional world consisting of thousands upon thousands of screens. Its tone is very experimental and inconsistent, with apartments and modern cities just a stone's throw away from enchanted forests and magic wands. Each player was given a house that existed within each of these cities. Interaction with the world worked based on an object-oriented programming, which Farmer and Morningstar describe as being invaluable to the expansion of the game. A virtual world of this scale was unprecedented, and a living, breathing community of connected players, the back and forth between the community and developers, had never been seen like this. It essentially launched as a sandbox MMO, where a limitless number of objects could be implemented by the designers and given a number of ways to interact with. You could write messages on a piece of paper and put the paper up on a bulletin board, store objects in containers and lock them up, or start businesses by selling items. The game had an economy of tokens, but the value of money wasn't clear from the get-go. As there was no set goal, what did players have to spend on or value? The answer would predict the direction the game ultimately went in. See, in the initial design document, avatars would only have one generic male and female appearance. Programmer Eric Wilmunder thought that was too limited, and so designed a system where players could change their height, the pattern of their clothes, and most importantly, their heads. Over 200 different heads were created, but only 30 were made available from the start. Many were given as rewards for quests or for certain prices from AI vendors. Heads became a valuable commodity for the player base, as it was the most colorful way they had to express themselves. Eventually, Habitat was less about the in-game content and more about the ways that the content furthered player interaction. That was the most important. It didn't start like that, however. In the 1990 paper, The Lessons of Lucasfilm's Habitat, Farmer and Morningstar describe how the relationship with the player base evolved. The first goal-directed event planned for Habitat was a rather involved treasure hunt called the Denalzi Island Adventure. It took us hours to design, weeks to build, including a 100-region island, and days to coordinate the actors involved. It was designed much like the puzzles in an adventure game. We thought it would occupy our players for days. In fact, the puzzle was solved in about 8 hours by a person who had figured out the critical clue in the first 15 minutes. Many of the players hadn't even had a chance to get into the game. The result was that one person had had a wonderful experience, dozens of others were left bewildered, and a huge investment in design and setup time had been consumed in an eye blink. Again and again, we found that activities based on often unconscious assumptions about player behavior had completely unexpected outcomes, when they were not simply outright failures. It was clear that we were not in control. The more people we involved in something, the less in control we were. We could influence things, we could set up interesting situations, we could provide opportunities for things to happen, but we could not predict nor dictate the outcome. Propelled by these experiences, we shifted into a style of operations in which we let the players themselves drive the direction of the design. This proved far more effective. Instead of trying to push the community in the direction we thought it should go, we tried to observe what people were doing and aid them in it. We became facilitators as much as designers and implementers. This often meant adding new features and new regions to the system at a frantic pace, but almost all of what we added was used and appreciated, since it was well matched to people's needs and desires. As the experts on how the system worked, we could often suggest new activities for people to try or ways of doing things that people might not have thought of. In this way, we were able to have considerable influence on the system's development in spite of the fact that we didn't really hold the steering wheel. More influence, in fact, than we had had when we were operating under the delusion that we controlled everything. This was a new problem, the balance between shepherding a world, yet having little control over what was done in it. They go on to describe the challenge of designing new areas. Certain things could be designed algorithmically, like an apartment layout, for instance. However, the very properties which make some parts of the world amenable to such techniques also make those same parts of the world among the least important. It's really not a problem if every apartment building looks pretty much like every other. It is a big problem if every enchanted forest looks the same. Places whose value lies in their uniqueness, or at least in their differentiation from the places around them, need to be crafted by hand. The developers took detailed notes of the behaviors they saw in their players. Everyone was trying to figure out how this whole thing worked, and Farmer ended up breaking down players into 5 different categories. Number 1. The passive. Easily 50% of the number of users fall into this category, but they probably use only 20% of the connect time. They tend to cross over to Habitat only to read their mail, collect their 100 token bonus, and read the weekly newspaper. They tend to show up for events ad hoc and when the mood strikes. This is the most important area for development. Special events and activities need to target this on for just a few minutes group. This group must be led by the hand to participate. They tend to want to be entertained, with no effort, like watching TV. The trick here is to encourage active participation. The newspaper he refers to here were things like the weekly rant, a player-run tabloid consisting of anywhere from 30 to 50 pages covering news from both inside and outside the game world. Number 2. The Active. This group is the next largest and made up of the bulk of the paying user hours. The active user participates in 2 to 5 hours of activities a week. They tend to log into Habitat right after connecting. They send out ESP messages to others online to find out what is going on. They always have a copy of the latest paper, and gripe if it comes out late. This group's biggest problem is overspending. They really like Habitat and lose track of the time spent out there. The watchword here is be thrifty. Now, ESP was Habitat's form of personalized messages or whispers. If the game were made today, it would have probably used an item like a cell phone for this, but Habitat was developed before those existed. 3. The Motivators. The real heroes of Habitat. The Motivators understand that Habitat is what they make of it. They set out to change it. They throw parties, start institutions, open businesses, run for office, start moral debates, become outlaws, and win contests. Motivators are worth their weight in gold. 1 motivator for every 50 passive/active users is wonderful. Nurture these people. 4. The Caretakers. Usually already employees. The Caretakers are mature motivators. They tend to help the new users, control personal conflicts, record bugs, suggest improvements, run their own contests, officiated functions, and in general keep things running smoothly. There are far fewer of these than motivators. Out of a pilot group of about 400, we had 3. What you want to do with a caretaker is groom him for Geek Godhood, or system operators. I was the first Oracle/operator. The operator's job is most important. It really is like being a Greek god from the ancient writings. The Oracle grants wishes and introduces new items and rules into the world. With one bold stroke of the keyboard, the operator can create or eliminate bank accounts, entire city blocks, or the family business. This is a difficult task as one must consider the repercussions of any external effects to the world. Think about this. Would you be mad at God if one day suddenly electricity didn't work anymore? Habitat is a world. As such, someone should run it that has experience in that area. I suggest at least 10 years experience in fantasy role-playing and 2 years on telecommunications networks, specifically ones with chat programs. A geek god must understand both consistency in fictional worlds and the people who inhabit it. To optimize the Habitat funativity experience, the goal is to move the user from his/her present category to the next one up: passive, active, motivator, caretaker, and geek god. Move everyone 1 role to the right, and you will have a successful, self-maintaining system. Read, you will make bags of money. Remember when I mentioned the in-game token economy? Each avatar spawned with 2000 T, as it was called, and received a 100 T login bonus every day. Items could be purchased from AI shops called Vendroids, and there was no limit to the items, nor production involved, meaning that they would be produced out of thin air, as Farmer describes. This, naturally, opened up the very real problem of runaway inflation, and they got their first taste of it with what he calls the Big Doll Crystal Ball scam. Items didn't have universal prices. They were set by the developers, but were different from one Vendroid to another. Items could also be resold to pawn machines, but not what they were bought for. Pawn machines had their own prices as well. Some crafty players discovered that there were 2 Vendroids across town from each other that both sold items for less than they could be pawned off for. Dolls were 75 T to resell for 100, and crystal balls were 18,000 T, resold for 30,000. They spent the next few hours going back and forth across the city until at least 3 players had anywhere from 1 to 500,000 tokens. This massively inflated the token supply by 5 times what it was the previous day. We assumed the precipitous increase in T1 was due to some sort of bug in the software. We were puzzled that no bug report had been submitted. By poking around a bit, we discovered that a few people had suddenly acquired enormous bank balances. We sent habitat mail to the 2 richest, inquiring as to where they had gotten all that money overnight. Their reply was, "We got it fair and square, and we're not going to tell you how." After much abject pleading on our part, they eventually did tell us, and we fixed the erroneous pricing. In a surprisingly heartwarming twist, these players would take chunks of their new fortunes, hide them around the world, and set up their own treasure hunts for other players to solve. The developers added weapons to the initial game because they felt that it would create conflict, and conflict would drive interaction. What they were not expecting was the player reaction to virtual murder. When an avatar is killed, he or she is teleported back home, head and hands, literally, pockets empty, and any object in hand at the time dropped on the ground at the scene of the crime. Any possessions carried at the time are lost. It was more like a setback in a game of chutes and ladders than real mortality. Nevertheless, the death metaphor had a profound effect on people's perceptions. This potential for murder, assault, and other mayhem in Habitat was, to put it mildly, controversial. Real debates began to emerge about whether or not killing someone in a video game was comparable to actual murder, regardless of the actual consequences in and out of game. Again, all of this was very new, and so people having what might be seen as a silly reaction at the time is actually pretty understandable. The developers ran a poll. Should murder be taken out of the game? The results? 50% yes, 50% no. One side found it deplorable, or at the very least, annoying. The other thought it was just another part of the fun. In response, a real-life Greek Orthodox minister began a ministry in the game, the Order of the Holy Walnut. Members of the order were forbidden from carrying weapons, stealing, killing, and otherwise griefing. His church became quite popular, and he even presided over 3 Habitat marriages. 2 weeks after the last wedding, the first Habitat divorce was filed, and the proceedings were handled by the first Habitat lawyers. Okay, one more story. Ads ran in the rant for a new event opening up soon, the Dungeon of Death. The duo of Dread, Death and the Shadow, were challenging all players to enter their lair and beat their maze for a large token prize and teleportation wands. 2 system operators would log in with the aliases Death and the Shadow, armed with unique, specially programmed guns that would kill in a single shot, as well as magic wands that would heal away any injuries they had. The dungeon itself was littered with traps, dead ends, and confusing passages. All the while, these operators were scouring it to kill challengers and send them back home. The Dungeon of Death was a huge success, and one evening, a developer got their turn to log into the Death account. When he loaded in, however, he found himself in the dungeon, face to face with a player already armed. Whoever was using the account before had forgotten to heal themselves, and the dev was killed. Remember that when you die in Habitat, you drop the item you're holding, meaning that this player was now in possession of a one-shotting dev tool gun. It turned out that this was not the first time this had happened. During the previous night's mayhem, the special gun was similarly absconded with. In this case, the person playing Death was one of the regular system operators who, accustomed to operating the regular Q-Link service, had simply ordered the player to give the gun back. The player considered that he had obtained the weapon as part of the normal course of the game, and balked at this, whereupon the operator threatened to cancel the player's account and kick him off the system if he did not comply. The player gave the gun back, but was quite upset about the whole affair, as were many of his friends and associates on the system. Their world model had been painfully violated. Instead, the developers decided not to flex their admin powers over this user, but come to an agreement. They ESP'd her, still role-playing as the Grim Reaper, and threatened to kill her if she didn't give the gun back. She retaliated and reminded them that as long as she stayed inside of a city, player killing was not allowed. This was one of the solutions they'd come up with for the murder problem. We negotiated a deal whereby Death would ransom the gun for 10,000 tokens. An elaborate arrangement was made to meet in the center of town to make the exchange, with a neutral third avatar acting as an intermediary to ensure that neither party cheated. Of course, word got around, and by the time of the exchange, there were numerous spectators. We played the role of Death to the hilt, with lots of hokey, melodramatic shtick. The event was a sensation. It was written up in the newspaper the next morning and was the talk of the town for days. The avatar involved was left with a wonderful story about having cheated Death, we got the gun back, and everybody went away happy. These two very different responses to an ordinary operational problem illustrate our point. Operating within the participant's world model produced a very satisfactory result. On the other hand, taking what seemed like the expedient course, which involved violating the world model, provoked upset and dismay. Working within the system was clearly the preferred course in this case. This is really what I find fascinating about the whole Habitat experiment. A game of identical premise based off Habitat called Club Caribay would be launched a few years later, but Habitat itself would close after 2 years. However, the lessons the team learned are invaluable and still relevant to gaming today. In fact, I think more so than ever before. How many games have you heard about that fell off, with people complaining about developers not listening to their players? Or better yet, how many times have you heard this one? They're developing the game based around how they want people to play, not how they actually play. At the tail end of Morningstar and Farmer's Paper, they leave off with one final, cumulative message for those looking to create their own cyber worlds.
Get real.
In a discussion of cyberspace on Usenet, one worker in the field dismissed Club Caribay as uninteresting, with a comment to the effect that most of the activity consisted of inane and trivial conversation. Indeed, the observation was largely correct. However, we hope some of the anecdotes recounted above will give some indication that more is going on than those inane and trivial conversations might indicate. They are paying money for this service. They don't view what they do as inane and trivial, or they wouldn't do it. To insist this presumes that one knows better than they what they should be doing. Such presumption is another manifestation of the omniscient central planner who dictates all that happens. A role that this entire article is trying to deflect you from seeking. In a real system that's going to be used by real people, it's a mistake to assume that the users will all undertake the sorts of noble and sublime activities which you created the system to enable. Most of them will not. Cyberspace may indeed change humanity, but only if it begins with humanity as it really is.